Hi, I'm Eric Houston, and this is Press Play, a show about movies. Lately I've been thinking a lot more about 50s sci-fi films, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is that I recently rewatched the classic science fiction film Forbidden Planet. And the other is that I also recently got a text from my dad sending me a photograph of a hat, a kind of squarish gray hat with a pin on it and asking me if I knew what the hat was from, and I did not. I had to resort to Google image search to find out that it was indeed a hat fashioned to look like the hats in the movie Forbidden Planet. So there you go. Forbidden Planet is certainly a movie that my dad and I share. It's one of those movies that we owned a copy of when I was growing up. So saw it or parts of it several times then. And one of my fondest movie-going memories is when I was in college going to the university movie theater where they had gotten a 35 millimeter print of Forbidden Planet, and taking my dad there to see that movie was a lot of fun. Watching it today, or recently, for the first time in quite a while, Forbidden Planet is still a very good movie. If you haven't seen it, it's about a crew of a distinctly, very much specifically American spaceship landing on this planet, looking for a group of scientists, and finding only one scientist left, Dr. Morbius, who lives on the planet alone with his daughter and with a robot. The robot is famous. He's known as Robbie the Robot. He gets his own credit, and certainly for the 1950s, he is a marvel of special effects. It is just a suit that a guy walks around in, but what a suit it is. Especially the head, which is a little bit inhuman, which was unusual for the time, and features all kinds of moving doodads. Robbie was immediately a memorable character, and he really steals the movie. The rest of the movie is a lift from Shakespeare's The Tempest, as the crew of the spaceship start to realize that the alien creature that killed all the other inhabitants of the planet is actually controlled by Dr. Morbius's mind. As I'm talking to you right now, I'm questioning whether or not the character's name is Dr. Morbius, but we're going to stick with that. The movie stars Leslie Nielsen as, I think he's the captain of the ship, but at any rate, the main ship guy. And it's interesting to look back at movies where Leslie Nielsen is being serious and wants to be taken seriously. I think Walter Pidgeon plays the scientist. Of course, you've got Robbie the Robot as himself, stealing absolutely every scene that he's in. And yeah, it's a pretty good movie. If I'm being honest, you tend to feel the length a little bit, which is one of those things about the sci-fi movies of the 50s, and a thing I've been thinking about a lot lately. When we look back to the 1930s and the 1940s, science fiction movies were sort of by and large monster movies. Dracula, Frankenstein, especially those Universal monster movies, and things like King Kong from RKO, were taking up a lot of the space of the sort of science fiction genre, and really straddling, I think, a line between horror and science fiction as those genres were figuring themselves out in the early days of the movies. But by the 1950s, we're post-World War II, and I think a big change has happened in the way science fiction movies work. For one, we're moving away from monsters, or at least away from the sort of monsters that were Dracula and Frankenstein, bloodsuckers and creatures of myth and folklore, to more science-based monsters. The monster in Forbidden Planet being this sort of energy being, this creature of thought, right? And there are other, thinkier monsters like that, and I'll talk about some more of those in a minute, but they're creatures of science. Even Godzilla, King Kong's just a big gorilla living on an island somewhere. But Godzilla is specifically the product of nuclear blasts, nuclear testing, which immediately ties the movie to the aftermath of World War II. The other thing about those earlier monster and science fiction movies are that the protagonists were often, aristocrats, very commonly, But by the 1950s, a lot of those sorts of characters, the aristocrats and I'm reluctant to call them normal people because they were often rich as hell, but the sort of regular people characters and protagonists have been replaced largely by scientists and by military figures, which makes a lot of sense. In World War II, American society really started to see, both in movies and in real life, and to trust in scientists and the military as the people who are going to solve everything and figure it out. And so it's not surprising that we see this reflected in the movies of the day, right? And so now more and more, the people who are at the center of these movies are doctors and military figures. In an earlier iteration of Forbidden Planet, something that maybe skewed closer to Frankenstein, it'd be easy to see Anne Frances's character, the daughter who's grown up on the planet, as being more of the hero and more, or at least the character that the plot revolves around, right? But in the movie that we get, the Forbidden Planet that we get, it's mostly the doctor and the spaceship captain who we are spending the most time with. And personally, as a result, I find that makes some of these movies a little bit antiseptic. Because these characters are so cerebral, it seems that we've pushed away from the emotion that drove movies like Frankenstein and Dracula to embrace something more clinical. And oftentimes, these scientific or military heroes are very cool customers. And it makes sense. It's what we wanted to see as a society at that time, was competent people solving problems. But I think we lost something in losing that emotionality, which is why when I watch Forbidden Planet today, I'm much more interested in Anne Frances and what she's going through as the only other human being who's been living on this planet, coming to realize that her father is the guy who's the source of her problems, and then like meeting other people and falling in love with the first time and all that. I tend to find that more interesting, but it's not where the movie's focus is. Still, Forbidden Planet is a stone cold classic. It looks great, and it is very interesting. It's just more cerebral than it is heartfelt, I think. And a lot of the movies of that era are, a lot of the great sci-fi. Something like This Island Earth, which is a movie about, gosh, now that I think about it, what is This Island Earth about? I guess it's a movie about some aliens that have landed on Earth, and they recruit Earth scientists to take back to their planet to try and help fix their planet. And also their planet is overrun by mutants, these guys, these sort of bug-looking aliens with giant brains. And again, the thing about This Island Earth is for about an hour, it's pretty boring. And then you get to the alien planet and you meet the mutants, and then it gets pretty fun. Another great one is The Day the Earth Stood Still. This is a movie that shares a lot of its DNA, I think, with Forbidden Planet. It's very cerebral. It's also another movie with an iconic robot. But in place of Robbie, we get Gort. And while Robbie is all like dials and curves and design, Gort is very simple, very streamlined, like just kind of a pure silver suit with a visor. The Day the Earth Stood Still is a movie about an alien who comes to Earth with an ultimatum, essentially, which is get your act together or else Gort here is going to destroy you. The plot's more complicated than that, but that's kind of the general idea of it. And Gort is certainly cool. And the movie centering a little bit more about the alien guy who's come to the Earth and his taking some time to get to know about humans helps to move it a little bit away from the cerebral, but it's still a very cerebral movie. But again, a very cool movie. Another one from that era that I don't think you can ignore is The Thing from Another World, a movie about a bunch of scientists in the Antarctic who uncover an evil vegetable alien buried in the ice, and then they start getting knocked off one by one. Another pretty cool movie. An early example of a movie with a lot of overlapping dialogue, which makes it interesting. It's also a movie, and I'm stalling on the guy's name here a little bit, but it's one of the few film roles for the guy who was the sidekick on You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx. And so it's fun to see him outside of that context and just acting in a movie. John Fenneman is that guy's name. So it's fun to see him there. Now, for me, though, the problem with The Thing from Another World, which is a movie I actually haven't seen in quite a while, is that it's been overshadowed by the more recent, now 40 years old, but the more recent remake, John Carpenter's The Thing. Now, that's a movie that still, it shares a lot of the shape of The Thing from Another World. It's a movie set in the Antarctic about a bunch of scientists. But I think one of the many things Carpenter does right in making what is absolutely one of my all-time favorite movies, and a really compelling and horrific movie that is both a horror movie and a science fiction movie, is that he shifts the focus. So you have all of these scientists there and military guys there, but the person who's at the center of the movie is Kurt Russell, who's playing the station's helicopter pilot. And he's a guy who doesn't even live in the base with the other guys. He has his own special shack out on the ice where he can live and things. And I think it's smart of Carpenter to give us a more relatable character, right? As audience members, we're not all scientists or military guys. So to have a more down-to-earth guy at the center of the narrative, I think really helps to propel it along. And that there are other guys like that around too, right? Like there's people who work at the station who are more support staff and who aren't really scientists. And the scientists that are there are, Carpenter gives a lot of humanity to, that we get to know as people. Like Wilford Brimley's character is a great example of that, of a guy who feels like a guy more than he feels like a scientist or a doctor. Other movies from the 1950s, if we're going to talk about the great science fiction movies in the 1950s, I got to talk about the 1-2 punch that is War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. Both based on H.G. Wells' books, both from the mind of the great filmmaker George Pal. He produced War of the Worlds and he actually directed The Time Machine. And these are both movies that have, much like the rest of these movies, whether we're talking about Robbie the Robot or talking about Gort, iconic props and set pieces. With the War of the Worlds, it's the Martian spacecraft, these sort of curved, floating craft with these sort of telescoping, lamp-like eye stalks with like the 3 multicolored lenses in them, right? Those are very cool. And it's also something that kind of rises out of limitations. In H.G. Wells's book, the Martians are their vehicles are described as tripods, and they walk on 3 legs. Well, that would have been hard to film, so Pal gives us these sort of floating ships that the Martians live in. And of course, because George Pal's got just a little bit of the showman, a little bit of the creature guy in him, we get to see one of the Martians too. But again, War of the Worlds, now instead of being, I think in H.G. Wells' book, it's mostly about a pretty passive character, but a guy witnessing everything. Now we're following a scientist in the form of Dr. Clayton Forrester, who Mystery Science Theater borrowed the name from, as he combats these aliens, right? And that's different even from Spielberg's War of the Worlds, where Tom Cruise, as the star, is very pointedly just kind of a guy who's dealing with everything that's going on. As I talk about this, I got to think, too, that part of the reason why the scientists get so centered in these movies in the 1950s is this that feeling, I think, in especially American society coming out of World War II, we're looking for a feeling of control. We're looking for people who can control the things, and surely a scientist can take care of it. In both the book, The War of the Worlds, and the Spielberg movie, War of the Worlds, it is ultimately human germs that kill the aliens. And Tom Cruise has nothing to do with germing up the aliens, right? But in Dr. Clayton Forrester, and it's frankly, it's been a while since I've seen the George Pal movie, so I don't exactly remember how it ends, we get a guy who maybe could figure that out. Whether he does or not, he's a guy who can figure out what we need are germs to kill these Martians, right? The Time Machine, though, may be my favorite of all of these movies. And I'm not entirely sure I'm going to be able to explain why. Again, we've got a scientist at the center of this thing. This is the guy who makes the time machine, right? And this is the movie that has that iconic time machine design where George Pal went, yeah, but let's make a real like steampunky Victorian time machine, where it's like a red recliner that the guy sits in, and there's all the knobs and levers and things, and a big spinning disc behind him to show that he's going back in time. This one's a lot of fun. I would say that of these movies, it's probably the least cerebral, which I think does add to the fun of it. Because while there's a science fiction concept in terms of time travel, the movie doesn't really care to explain to you how or why it's working. It's interested, I think, a little bit more in the emotional life of the time traveler scientist at the center of it, as he has his little musings. It's fun early in the movie to watch him slowly move forward through time, and as he watches time change in front of him and muses on changes in fashion and man's inability to give up on war. We also have a great side character in the form of the guy from Mr. Ed, right? He's in this movie as the time traveler's friend, and the time traveler encounters both him and then his descendants as he sort of moves forward through time, before ultimately losing control of the time machine and finding himself in the far future, where he has to fight the Morlocks, underground monster men, and hang out with the Eloi, who are all cute bimbos and things, right? It's a super fun movie, and I think it's that little bit of an embrace and attempt to both to explore the inner life of the time traveler, but also to take a lot of the control away from him, right? What does he have? What is he in control of? Well, for much of the movie, he's in control of moving forward or backward in time, but he doesn't have any ability to impact the things he sees happening. When he sees like nuclear war on the horizon as he moves into the future, he has no ability to stop it or do anything about it, but just sort of rue it and mourn it and watch the world fall away before him. When he gets to the future and the time machine is stolen by the Morlocks, well, now he's screwed, right? And while he, ultimately forms a plan to get the time machine back and to fight the Morlocks, the amount of change he can effect is limited, right? Because part of the deal is that the Eloi are somewhat enslaved by the Morlocks. And this is not a movie that's about our hero figuring out how to stop the Morlocks forever and save the Eloi. At the end of it, it's largely about him wanting to save his one girlfriend, if he can. And because of it, it's a little bit more melancholy of a movie than the sort of cool logic and problem solving of those other movies we've talked about. Now, I am not saying, now that sort of cool problem solving does mean, and it's funny because I do love competence in a movie. If you saw my review about Project Hail Mary, a thing I liked about it a lot, it's a movie about a scientist, right? And a scientist solving problems. But because they pair him with that cute little alien guy, we can get a lot of emotion in it too. And so I like a lot of problem solving, but I do need it leavened with emotion, which, is part of what attracts me always to the show Quantum Leap. I've been rewatching that show lately. And that's a show about a scientist who's traveling through time and he's solving people's problems, right? But the problems he's solving are largely not scientific problems. They're not, how do we figure out a clever science way to stop this monster? It's, how do I fix this terrible day that happened to this person? And meeting and empathizing with people along the way. And it's that extra dimensionality that really makes a movie sing for me, right? So all the movies that I've talked about tonight are good movies, are solid movies and classics. But if I'm being honest, when I'm watching them, a lot of the times halfway through, my attention starts to drift, as the ideas that are propelling it are ideas that, especially once you've seen it once, you've wrestled with already. And I need that little extra push to get me over the edge. But that, I think, is what defines science fiction in the 1950s, is cool, confident men solving problems. And it's something that's distinct, I think, from the more visceral monster movies of the 30s and from movies that followed it. But anyway, those are my thoughts on movies of the 1950s. I'll be back next time. In the meantime, stay safe, watch movies.